Okay, I am driving right now, so bear with me. I just wanted to pop on here and talk about hospice recertification. So a lot of family members don't take one. Sorry for the bloopers. We will try it this way. A lot of family members don't realize that on hospice, you can recertify and continue with hospice cares after 6 months. So I had a visit for one of my patients today, and it was a recert visit. This particular patient has been on for 9 months. So at the 6-month mark, we will do a telehealth visit with our doctors, and that is just so that the doctor can lay eyes on the patient and see what's going on. So we will update the doctors and give them a bit of information about our patients and just say this patient has been eating less, her mid-upper arm circumference is shrinking, as well as thigh and abdominal measurements. So those are the kind of things that we go over with hospice, and it's just to update the doctor and see if the patient is still qualifying for hospice. So we will do those every 6 months, and then we follow up with the visits every 2 to 3 months, and it's just good information to have. So it kind of tells you whether or not the patient is having decline. So we also monitor whether or not the patient is having a good appetite, if they're eating, or the percentage of meals that they eat per day. We also monitor whether or not they're sleeping a lot, or if they're having functional decline. So are they able to feed themselves, or are they totally dependent and having to have somebody else feed them? These are the type of things that we update our doctors on, and that we chart every time we see the patient. We are monitoring these type of things. So that's really how to tell if your patient or family member is going to recertify for hospice. We also monitor things like a PPS and a FAST score. So a FAST score is mostly for patients that have dementia or Alzheimer's, and then a PPS score is going to tell you about their functional well-being and their functional decline. So if a patient has a palliative performance score of 50% or lower, they will still continue to qualify for hospice, because that means that they're mainly in bed or mostly bedbound or chair fast, because their score is low and they are just unable to ambulate and do most things for themselves. So when people are totally dependent like that and have to have help in functional decline, that is when they will recertify for hospice, because they are dependent on somebody to help them. The FAST score is more to monitor how their neurological state is. So if a patient with really advanced Alzheimer's has a FAST score of 7A or worse, that means that they are incontinent of bowel and bladder, and they're unable to comprehend things and are having a hard time speaking even, or having a hard time having a full-on conversation, and they can't say more than a few words. We also like to monitor, this one's really important, and why we do the mid-upper arm measurements and the thigh and the abdominal measurements. It's to measure whether or not this patient is losing muscle or gaining muscle or weight. We also monitor weight. So every time there's a recertification visit, we're supposed to get the patient's weight, and if they are bedbound or unable to get out of bed, those measurements of the arm weight and those measurements of the thigh, arm, and abdomen really can tell whether or not a patient is gaining weight or losing muscle, like I said. So if they're unable to actually step on a scale, we also have wheelchair scales if they're able to get into a wheelchair, and if not, that's why we monitor on Adamant. We monitor and check the measurements of the arm, thigh, and abdomen. So it's really important that we monitor these things just to track whether or not the patient is having decline or if they are still doing okay. And if a patient, I've had family members that get upset when their family member, sorry, I say patient because they're my patient, when their family member is discharged from hospice, because it's, you know, they're receiving a lot of help, and technically sometimes it can be a good thing. Like, obviously, if your family member's doing well and they discharge from hospice, that's great, because they're not showing decline, and, you know, they're doing pretty good, and they're not going to, you know, progress in their illness and pass away in 6 months. So sometimes it is a good thing when you're discharged from hospice, but that is why we monitor whether or not they're having decline or not, to see whether they qualify or recertify for hospice. So that's just another thing that you can keep in mind with hospice, because a lot of people are like, okay, my family member has 6 months or less to live. And if you want, you can watch one of my earlier videos that I made it yesterday, and it's just about how I had a family member call me, and she was upset that her dad was put on hospice, and she was just kind of having a hard time with it. And I told her, you know, just because the doctor says that your family member needs hospice, it's probably mostly because he needs comfort cares, and he wants your family member to be comfortable at this time in his life. So it doesn't always mean that your family member is going to pass away. And that's why we monitor for all of these types of decline, to see if the illness is progressing or if your family member is doing okay and can discharge from hospice. So it's not always a bad thing that they're discharging from hospice. So if you have any other questions about hospice or anything at all, let me know.